the cross. Probably the most recognizable symbol in the world. One of the first things you may notice on a church, and usually the symbol that is given the greatest prominence, is the cross. It is on the steeple. It hangs over the pulpit and over the altar. It is carried in procession in the church services. The sign of the cross is marked on our foreheads with holy oil at baptism, and it is marked on us again when we are sick or nearing the end of life. The cross is a sign we make over ourselves whenever we enter a church and when we leave it. It is a sign of forgiveness and hope. It is a sign of thanksgiving. It is the ultimate sign of blessing. Christian worship is filled with all sorts of symbols, but none are more important or more prevalent than the cross. And very often, the church building itself is laid out in this shape. For Christians, the cross, which began as a symbol of death, became for them the ultimate symbol of Christ's victory over death. So walk into almost any church, and the symbol you will see more than any other is the cross. Some crosses will be quite simple and plain, while others, crucifixes, will show in sometimes graphic detail Jesus' death upon the cross. Some crosses will depict Jesus as a king. Others will show him as a great high priest. But they are all meant to draw our minds to Christ, to remind us of his life, death, and resurrection, and sometimes to tell us something about who he was and is. Not all crosses are alike. And while they are all meant to remind us of the story of Jesus, some crosses tell an extra story all their own. Take a look at the crosses on the front doors of the Church of the Ascension. There are 3 sets of doors that lead into the church, and in the middle of each door, right underneath the window, is a little cross. Now you may think, well, a cross is a cross. It means it's a church. But there are 6 different crosses on these doors, and they are meant to say something about what kind of church this is and what its history is. Look at the crosses on the center doors, for instance. On the front is what looks like a very plain standard cross. This is known as a Latin cross, and this is the type of cross most closely associated with the Western Catholic churches. But open the doors and look on the other side. This is a Latin cross that has been turned upside down, and it has a very special meaning. There's an ancient tradition that St. Peter, the rock on which Jesus founds his church, did not think himself worthy to be crucified in exactly the same way as his Lord. So when he was to be executed, he asked to be crucified upside down. So this upside down cross is meant to remind us of the story of St. Peter, who was the first bishop of Rome, the first pope, if you will. And it was one of St. Peter's successors, Pope Gregory the Great, who in the year 596 sent a monk named Augustine to Britain to evangelize the population and to establish the church there. Augustine was not the first Christian to come to Britain. There had been Christians in Britain when it was still a Roman province. In fact, some traditions say that the first martyr for the faith in Britain, St. Alban, was a Roman soldier. There had also been Christians that had established monasteries in Ireland, Scotland, and in the north of modern-day England. These Celtic Christians had a cross design all their own, too. A Latin cross surrounded by a circle like this one here. One of the greatest saints of the Celtic Christians, St. Cuthbert, wore a cross around his neck that had its own unique shape. A copy of it hangs next to the lectern in this church too. St. Cuthbert was based in northern England in a region called Northumbria and in Scotland. Now, the patron saint of Scotland, as many of you may know, is St. Andrew. St. Andrew, like his brother St. Peter, had a cross all his own. This is called a cross saltire. And the story goes that Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross like this. Well, since Andrew was the patron saint of Scotland, his cross became a symbol of Scotland too. It's in the Scottish flag. And when Scotland and England were joined to be the United Kingdom in 1707, that cross got to be incorporated with St. George's cross, the patron saint of England, into the Union Jack, the modern British flag. Many years later, after the American colonies had declared independence from Great Britain, the leaders of the churches in North America that had been a part of the Church of England now needed to find bishops that would be willing to consecrate an American bishop to serve in the Episcopal Church. Bishops are ordained in succession, and it is a succession that we believe goes all the way back to the apostles. You need 3 bishops to create a new bishop. And when the English bishops were at first unwilling, the Americans went to Scotland. So the first bishop in the Episcopal Church in the United States of America, Samuel Seabury, was consecrated in Scotland by Scottish bishops. Now, when Augustine, the monk sent by Pope Gregory, first landed in Britain to establish the church there, he settled in Kent, in the southeast, in a town called Canterbury. Augustine becomes the first Archbishop of Canterbury. And ever since, the Archbishop of Canterbury has been the premier bishop of the Church of England and still remains as a spiritual authority in Anglican churches that descend from the Church of England, like ours. As you may have guessed by now, Canterbury has its own cross, and it looks like this. Finally, there is one more cross on these front doors, and it's this one. This is a Jerusalem cross. The Jerusalem cross developed as a symbol in the Middle Ages, and for a while it was a symbol of the Crusader kingdom in Jerusalem. This is a reminder of where all of Christian worship begins. Not in Scotland, not in Canterbury, not in Rome, but in Jerusalem. In fact, many Christian churches are built facing the east, facing the rising sun, and facing Jerusalem. So you see, these crosses are more than just pretty decorations on the outside of the church. They are here to tell a story. It's a story that begins with Jesus in Jerusalem, but it is a story that continues with you and me here in this place whenever we walk through these doors. The first space that you enter when walking into many churches is called the narthex. The narthex is essentially the foyer, or the lobby of the church. When entering this space in this church, the first thing that you are liable to notice are these stained glass windows. The windows in these doors are actually very new, but they were designed to reflect the style of the older windows inside. The outside windows depict 4 archangels, or angels, 2 of which you may be very familiar with from Scripture. In Luke's Gospel, the angel Gabriel announces to the Virgin Mary that she is with child. So here, Gabriel is presented with the symbol of the horn as the announcing angel. And Gabriel also holds a banner reading, Ave Maria, gratia plena, Hail Mary, full of grace. Here we also see lily flowers. Now, we often associate the lily with Easter, but the lily is also a symbol of the Virgin Mary. On the opposite side of the entrance is Michael, our defender in battle. This window was given as a memorial to veterans and law enforcement officers. Michael is the patron saint of the police and of the military. And Michael is usually dressed as a soldier or as a warrior. Michael is in John's vision in the book of Revelation, where John says that Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. I guess that you could say that there are actually 5 angels in these windows, because he used to be one. Since World War I, the poppy has been a symbol for remembering those lost in battle. In many Anglican churches throughout the world, including this one, the second Sunday in November, the Sunday closest to Armistice Day or Veterans Day, is known as Remembrance Sunday. And people wear poppies to remember fallen soldiers and to give thanks for those who risked all. And here are Michael's poppies. I guess it is fitting that this window should be directly across from the memorial plaques that remember the members of this parish that served in the 2 world wars. And Michael's symbol are the scales of justice. There are a couple other angels here that you may not have heard of before: Raphael and Uriel. You may not have heard of these 2 angels because they are found in books that are not in everyone's Bible. There is a special category of scriptures called deuterocanonical scriptures. They are sometimes referred to as the Apocrypha. Some Bibles include them, some don't. They are very old books, and Jesus would certainly have been familiar with some of them. But the Church does not hold these books to be as authoritative as the canonical books of the Bible. They are useful for instruction, but we don't use them to establish doctrine. One of those books is the Book of Tobit. There is a story in the Book of Tobit where Tobias, the young man, goes out walking by the river Tigris with his little dog and is accompanied by the archangel Raphael. And while he is there, a great fish jumps up out of the river and into his arms. And the angel teaches Tobias how to use the parts of the fish for medicine. And so Raphael's symbol is the holy oil that we use to anoint the sick in our prayers for healing. Raphael is the angel of healing. Oh, and some of you may recognize this little dog. And finally, we come to Uriel. Uriel is probably the most obscure of these angels. Uriel is found in the 2nd book of Esdras. In that book, the prophet Ezra is so upset with God for all of the unfairness in the world, and he challenges God to explain himself. And the angel Uriel meets him and says, "Your understanding has utterly failed regarding this world. And do you think that you can comprehend the way of the Most High?" Uriel goes on to say, "For as the land has been assigned to the forest and the sea to its waves, so also those who inhabit the earth can understand only what is on the earth. And he who is above the heavens can understand what is above the height of the heavens." So here we see in their little boxes the leaves of the forest separated from the blue of the waves of the sea.
Uriel's symbol is that of the pen and book.
Uriel is supposed to be the inspirer of poets. There's one tradition that has Uriel as the angel of the Passover. So down here you will see two little Passover lambs. The name Uriel means God is my light. And so here in Uriel's hands, you'll see a ball of light. And in the middle, in these little Hebrew letters, is the name of God.
The two center doors are mostly clear glass that allow people outside to see in. But what they allow you to see is very important, because standing outside looking in, one can see all the way up to the high altar where Christ's body and blood are consecrated and reserved under the form of bread and wine. So here we see little sheaves of wheat and a ciborium, another Latin word for the silver vessel that holds the blessed bread, and here a grape leaf and a chalice. Up in the corner of each door is a little Tudor rose.
So let's be clear about something. Henry VIII did not found the Church of England. The church throughout the world is founded by Jesus Christ. Saints like Alban, Augustine, Aidan, and Cuthbert can take credit for evangelizing and for spreading the church in England, for helping it to grow. But they didn't found it. It was God's creation through Jesus. But nonetheless, Henry, his son Edward, and his daughters Mary and Elizabeth would have a profound influence upon the eventual shape that the Church of England would take.
Henry famously split the church in England from the Pope's control. His son Edward would try to make it even more Protestant. His daughter Mary would try to make it Roman Catholic again. And finally, Elizabeth would settle on a church that was separate from Rome, but not nearly as Protestant as some reformers in her kingdom would have liked.
Love them or hate them, agree with their decisions or not, that one family had a profound effect on the history of the Anglican Church, and the Tudor that rose there reminds us of that. So think about this for a second. You have barely walked into a church, and already you are overwhelmed by symbols that say so much about what the people that worship here believe about God. They believe in a God that heals and protects. They believe in a God that feeds and nourishes us. They believe in a God that informs and inspires. We learn all of that from some symbols on colored and painted glass. And we haven't even gotten into the church proper yet.
The first thing that you are liable to come to as you enter a church is this: the baptismal font. Now, baptismal fonts are not always at the entrance to the church. Sometimes they are off to the side. Sometimes they are in another building altogether. And it isn't necessary that one has to be baptized inside a church building. You can be baptized in a lake, or in a river, or in the ocean, or in a hospital room. We remember that Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan. You can be baptized in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost anywhere there is water.
But very often, one of the first things that you will come to when you enter a church just inside the west doors is this: the baptismal font. It stands here as a symbol and as a reminder that this is how we truly enter the church. This is how we become members of Christ's body, through baptism. Once upon a time, in early church days, unbaptized individuals would have had to stand in the narthex.
We don't do that anymore. We welcome unbaptized people to come in and sit with the congregation, to pray with us, and to listen to the message that we proclaim. But still, this stands here as a reminder that this is how we become a part of the story that this building proclaims. Baptism is the first great sacrament, the first outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace that God gives us. The Church has at times argued about the number of sacraments and the sacramental nature of things like confirmation and marriage, but it has always been clear on the two great sacraments, baptism and Holy Eucharist, or communion.
So here you will see lined up together the beginning and the end. But our journey or our pilgrimage toward communion with God at the altar begins here at the font. And speaking of pilgrimage, this little silver shell that is used to pour water over the heads of candidates during the ritual of baptism was brought back to this parish from some pilgrims of our own, our youth, that went to one of the world's greatest shrines, Santiago de Compostela in Spain. It is the burial site of one of Jesus' followers, St. James, and his symbol is the scallop shell. The scallop shell became the symbol of a pilgrim, so perhaps it is fitting that it is also associated with baptism, because in baptism we all become pilgrims. And this is also the perfect example of how an item that has a very practical use can take on symbolic meaning.
The main body of the church, and the place where the majority of the congregation gathers, is called the nave. It is the Latin word that means ship. And if you look up at the ceiling in this church, you could almost imagine yourself looking at the upside-down hull of a ship. A ship is probably a great way to think of the church, actually. One is reminded of Noah's Ark, or the disciples, the fishermen, being tossed on a stormy sea until at least Jesus calms the waters. It is helpful to think of the church as a ship because it is a reminder that we are all on this journey together. We may be in separate places, even living at separate times, but we Christians are all in the same boat together. Once we get inside, we are surrounded by more windows that tell us more about the God that is worshipped here. And that is what stained glass windows are intended to do. They are not meant to be merely pretty or decorative. They should teach us and inspire us. They should draw our hearts and minds to sacred stories. That is what all of our religious images should do.
And what is so magnificent about stained glass is that the light enters this space through this story. In this church, all along this wall, you have the story of Jesus. And it wraps around over onto this side too. And these windows, they speak in the language of symbol. And sometimes you have to look really closely at them to notice all of the details and all of the symbols that direct us to different parts of the story.
Take this window of the Last Supper, for instance. The look on Jesus' face as he holds up the bread and the wine is so transfixing that it is easy to miss what is happening in the background as Judas sneaks off to betray him. In between the windows, Moving in the opposite direction are the Stations of the Cross, a traditional devotion that walks us through the last moments of Jesus' life.
After Jesus' ascension, the windows over here start telling the story of the church. First, the universal church, then the church in England, and then further down, the Episcopal Church. I mentioned earlier the influence that the Tudor family had on the Church of England, and this gentleman is a perfect example of that. This is Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer was Archbishop of Canterbury under King Henry VIII. And he was responsible for taking the many and various medieval liturgies of the Church and translating and compiling them into the first Book of Common Prayer.
Cranmer was heavily influenced by very Protestant ideas from the continent. He wanted to make the Church of England a very reformed Protestant church. But those dreams were eventually cut short by Henry's daughter, Mary. She was a Roman Catholic, and when she came to the throne, she had Cranmer burned as a heretic.
Cranmer had signed a document recanting some of his heretical opinions. But right before he died, he famously retracted his recantation, reaffirmed his beliefs, and then shoved the hand that signed the document into the fire first. And here is his burning hand. Now, I must admit that were I living in the time of the Reformation, Cranmer and I would probably not have been friends. I am very Catholic-minded, and I love the rituals of the medieval church. Cranmer preferred things a bit more stripped down.
For Cranmer, the most powerful symbols of the church were the words it used in worship. Words were vitally important to Cranmer. The words of the Bible that had been recently translated into English, and the words of the prayers of the church, which he helped to craft.
But you know, as much as I sometimes disagree with Cranmer, at every Mass I am reminded of what a gift he left the church through his words. This church uses traditional language in most of its worship, language that we get largely from Cranmer. And whenever I kneel down to say my favorite prayer in the entire prayer book, the prayer of humble access, the one that we say right before receiving communion, I am reminded of what a gift it is that he's given me and how he has shaped my faith. My faith has been shaped by someone that I probably would not have liked and seldom agreed with. I guess that's what it means to be on this ship called the church together. We worship side by side with people we disagree with.
On the opposite side of the nave from Cranmer is a little shrine, something that Cranmer probably would not have approved of. But this is a little bit of English church history as well, and it is much older than Cranmer. In the year 1061, a young English girl named Richildis, living in the little village of Walsingham in Norfolk, had a vision of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. And in this vision, Mary asked Richildis to build a replica of her home in Nazareth, right there in Walsingham. You know, there are famous apparitions of the Virgin Mary in history. There are faithful individuals that have claimed to have had a vision of her, like Bernadette of Lourdes. So there is Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady of Knock. But this was one of the earliest ones. And the little house that Richildis built became a major holy shrine in England. It was a major pilgrimage site that was visited by kings and queens and pilgrims of every variety. it was known as England's Nazareth. That is, until the Reformation, when Henry dissolved the monasteries and his commissioner, Thomas Cromwell, an architect of the English Reformation and a contemporary of our friend Cranmer over there, had the shrine at Walsingham torn down and the statue inside burned. But in the early 20th century, a priest in the Church of England named Hope Paton, who was influenced by another type of church reformer that sought to revive and restore much of what was lost in the Reformation, well, he rebuilt the shrine and had a new statue created, and it is a pilgrimage site once more. In fact, that is where this statue of Our Lady of Walsingham comes from. It was brought here from Walsingham by some pilgrims from this church. So here is a religious symbol that is telling multiple stories. It is telling the story of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. It is telling the story of Richildis, the girl who had the vision of Mary and built the shrine in Walsingham. It tells a story of destruction and renewal, and it tells the story of the faith of the pilgrims that brought her back here so that the faithful people in this place would have an aid to devotion. And that is what shrines like this are. They are an aid to devotion. That is what the entire church is meant to be. Not just a place to gather, but an aid to devotion, a place where something is offered to God. And one of the things that you will frequently see offered to God in shrines, in churches, and just about anywhere are candles. Candles are lit at just about every worship service in this church, and it is not because we need the light to read by. In here, candles are lit as an offering to God, and usually people make an offering of money and an offering of prayer whenever they light a candle. From the very beginning, fire has been used in the worship of God. It is perhaps one of the greatest symbols of God because it has the power to be creative and destructive. Fire is perhaps the greatest blessing in human life, second only to life itself, but it must be respected. Fire for Christians is a symbol of the light of Christ that has come into the world, but it is also a symbol of the Holy Spirit. The flame of these candles helps us to see the prayers that we are offering to God that otherwise might be invisible. The stand where the candles sit is called a votive stand. Votive is a Latin word meaning vow, and votive candles were lit as a symbol of a vow being made to God, or a vow being fulfilled, or of a solemn request to God. And they were also often lit at the end of a pilgrimage. In many churches, you may find a little box or a cabinet attached to the wall. This box is called an aumbry, and it is a place where the holy oils are kept. The church has 3 holy oils that it uses: the oil of chrism, the oil of the sick, and the oil of catechumens. Think about this. Whenever you walk into a church or into a shrine and you see candles burning, well, each one of those candles is someone's prayer. And the statue, as lovely as it is not what is being worshipped here, although some people often make that assumption. We know that this is just paint on wood. It isn't actually the Virgin Mary and Jesus. And yet, insofar as this statue has the power to draw our hearts and minds to Jesus and his mother, it is holy.
There is another great candle and symbol of Christ here in the nave, but we will explore that in the next episode, when we will ascend these chancel steps and enter a vision of heaven.